She walked into the dealership wearing jeans and a plain white t-shirt, casually asking about a luxury car. The salesman gave her a quick once-over, his face twisted with judgment. "Sorry, but I think you're in the wrong place," he said with a sneer, motioning toward the door. "These cars start at $300,000. The staff chuckled quietly, and curious customers turned to stare. Her cheeks burned with embarrassment, but she didn't say a word. She just turned around and left. The next morning, a shiny Rolls-Royce Phantom rolled up in front of the same dealership. When the back door opened, the salesman froze, mouth slightly open. He never saw it coming. The sun reflected off the glass walls of Boston Luxury Motors, lighting up the high-end vehicles inside. Porsches, Bentleys, Ferraris, each more extravagant than the last. Eleanor Collins, Ellie to friends, stepped inside, her brown ponytail swaying as she walked. She wore the same jeans, the same white t-shirt, and barely any makeup. She wasn't there to impress anyone. At 35, she carried herself with a calm self-assurance that came from truly knowing who she was. What you couldn't tell from her low-key appearance was that she was the founder of the Mitchell Foundation for Children with Disabilities, a non-profit that had changed thousands of young lives. Long before she met her husband, she built it from scratch, driven by her education and passion for special needs development. Her eyes were drawn to a stunning midnight blue coupe, perfect for her sister's 40th birthday. Caroline had always dreamed of owning a luxury car, and after surviving breast cancer last year, Ellie wanted to give her something unforgettable. She could easily afford it, thanks to her foundation's success and her own smart investments. But hardly anyone knew that. Across the showroom, sales manager Chadwick Thompson adjusted his blue tie and smoothed down his tailored navy suit. He prided himself on spotting serious buyers with just a glance. Seeing Ellie in her casual outfit, he let out a quiet laugh and nodded to his co-workers. "This should be fun." "Good morning," said a young salesman named Daniel, stepping over with a friendly smile. "Welcome to Boston Luxury Motors. I'm Daniel. Can I help you find something today?" Before Ellie could respond, Chadwick cut in. "I've got this, Daniel." He turned to Ellie, flashing a tight smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Looking for directions, ma'am?" Ellie kept her tone polite. "Actually, I'm interested in that midnight blue coupe over there." She pointed toward the $285,000 car on display. Chadwick's fake smile twitched. He'd seen this before. People stopping by to fantasize about cars they'd never own. With end-of-month numbers to hit and real buyers on their way, he wasn't in the mood for games. "That's the limited edition Azure. Only 15 made this year," he said slowly, like he was explaining something to a child. "You might want to check out our used car building. It's 3 blocks that way." Ellie noticed how his eyes flicked down to her beat-up sneakers. She was used to it, people assuming things based on appearances. What they didn't know was that she chose this simple lifestyle on purpose. It gave her peace. "I'd love to learn more about it," she said, still calm. "Is it possible to see the interior?" Chadwick's patience wore thin. Behind him, a couple of salesmen exchanged smirks. "The Azure is by appointment only," he lied smoothly. "Our more serious clients usually book private viewings." Just then, a couple wearing designer clothes walked in. Chadwick's attitude flipped in an instant. "Excuse me," he said without looking at Ellie. "Daniel can get you a brochure." Then he strode off with open arms. "Mr. and Mrs. Harrington, so good to see you again." Daniel looked embarrassed as he stepped back over to Ellie. He couldn't have been more than 25, and his suit looked like it belonged to his older brother. "I'm really sorry about that," he said softly. "Would you still like to hear about the Azure?" "I would." "Thanks," Ellie replied with a kind smile. As Daniel excitedly went over the car's features, Ellie watched Chadwick lead the fancy couple straight to the same car. He opened the door with a showy gesture and invited Mrs. Harrington inside. The same car he claimed wasn't available. "That's okay," Ellie told the now awkward Daniel. "I get how these things go." Across the showroom, Chadwick was busy giving his usual high-energy sales pitch, completely unaware that this was a moment he'd soon regret. "This model usually has an 8-month wait list," Chadwick said smoothly, "but I've reserved one for a few select clients." Mrs. Harrington traced her fingers over the leather seats. "It's beautiful, but I'm not sure the color is for me." "We can absolutely explore custom options," Chadwick assured her. Ellie walked up quietly, stopping just close enough to speak. "Excuse me, I'd like to ask about buying this model." Chadwick's face turned red. "As I said earlier, this vehicle is currently being shown to these customers," he said sharply, barely hiding his annoyance. "Maybe come back another time. Or, like I mentioned, check out our pre-owned inventory." The Harringtons glanced back and forth between Chadwick and Ellie, visibly uneasy. "I'm specifically interested in this one," Ellie said calmly. "It's for my sister's birthday next month." Chadwick stepped away from the couple, lowering his voice. "Look, I get it. People like to dream. But this is a professional space. That car costs more than most people's homes. I've been patient, but you're interrupting a real sale." By now, a few nearby customers had started paying attention. Daniel hovered in the background, clearly nervous. "I'm ready to pay in full, cash," Ellie said, keeping her cool. That's when Chadwick completely lost his composure. He let out a sharp laugh that echoed across the floor, loud enough for everyone to hear. Heads turned. "Cash?" he said, his voice dripping with disbelief. "Really? You think this is a garage sale? That car's worth $250,000. People who can afford something like that don't show up dressed like—" He waved a hand dismissively at her clothes. "That." Ellie felt her face heat up. Not with shame, but with anger. Not for herself, she'd been through this kind of treatment before, but for everyone who's ever been judged by how they look. "I believe my money is just as valid as anyone else's," she said quietly. Chadwick took a step closer, looming over her. "Let me be clear," he said coldly. "You're wasting my time and making a fool of yourself. If you want to talk seriously, come back with an appointment, dressed appropriately. Otherwise, please leave." The room had gone silent. Even the Harringtons had stepped away from the car, visibly uncomfortable. "Is there an issue here?" a new voice asked, cutting through the tension. Arthur Mason, the owner of the dealership, had walked over, drawn by the scene. Chadwick quickly straightened his tie. "No problem, sir. I was just explaining to this lady that we work by appointment with serious buyers." Arthur took in the situation quickly, the nervous staff, the watching crowd, Ellie's calm expression. His face didn't show much, but his tone was measured. "I see," he said. "Ellie Collins," she offered. "Eleanor Collins." "Well, Ms. "Collins," Arthur said. "Perhaps there was some confusion. Our clientele usually understands the level of exclusivity we offer here." "Oh, I understand perfectly," Ellie said, her voice steady despite the fire building in her chest. "Your sales manager has made the policies very clear." Chadwick stepped in again, his tone dripping with superiority. "If you're actually serious, which I doubt, you can call and make an appointment. But I suggest bringing proof of funds, and maybe dressing like someone who belongs here. These vehicles," he gestured around the room, "are meant for a certain type of clientele." The crowd murmured. Someone laughed under their breath. Ellie looked around, at the stares, the judgment, Chadwick's smug face. and the owner who hadn't said a word to defend her. She'd faced discrimination before, but rarely this open, this public. "I see," she said, quietly but firmly. Head held high, she turned and walked toward the exit. Behind her, she heard Chadwick's voice, just loud enough. "Some people really don't know their place." As she stepped into the crisp morning sunlight, Ellie pulled out her phone. The sting of humiliation was still fresh, but a small, determined smile curved her lips as she dialed. The Mitchell estate was set on 5 quiet acres just outside Boston. It had a quiet elegance that gave away nothing about the billions behind it. William Mitchell liked it that way. At 41, he'd made his fortune by revolutionizing renewable energy storage, and he kept a low profile by choice. When Ellie walked into his home office, William immediately looked up from his desk and got to his feet. 15 years of marriage had taught him how to read her face like a book. "What happened?" he asked, coming around the desk to meet her. Ellie dropped into a leather chair, the events of the morning still fresh. "It was educational," she said with a dry smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She told William everything, how the staff at the dealership had treated her like she didn't belong, how Chadwick talked down to her like she was invisible, how humiliating it felt to be dismissed because of what she was wearing. As she spoke, Alexander's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. He just listened, letting her work through the emotions. "It's not really about me," she said finally. "I'm lucky. I can walk away knowing the truth. But how many people get treated like that every day and have to just accept it, never knowing they were more than capable of affording what they were denied?" William nodded slowly. In all the years they'd been together, this was what always struck him most about Ellie, how deeply she cared for others, even when she was the one being hurt. "So, what do you want to do about it?" he asked gently. "Part of me wants to let it go," she admitted. "Just find another car for Caroline somewhere else. But then I think about that young guy, Daniel. He was respectful the whole time, even though everyone else wasn't. And I think about all the people who deal with this kind of judgment all the time and have no voice." She looked him in the eye. "They need to understand that someone's worth isn't tied to what they're wearing. But I'm not after revenge. I want to make a point. Open their eyes." William sat back, thinking. "I might have an idea that does exactly that," he said slowly. "Nothing over the top," Ellie warned, already knowing his instinct to protect her. "No buying the dealership and firing everyone." He chuckled. "No, nothing quite that cliché, but maybe just a little lesson in awareness." His eyes sparkled with the spark of a plan. Together, they began to map it out. Not for payback, but for impact. Something that might actually change hearts and minds more than any public takedown could. "Are you sure you don't want to come with me?" William asked once everything was set in motion. Ellie shook her head. "This isn't about me watching them squirm. It's about them learning to look beyond the surface." She smiled faintly. "But I do expect a full report." That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, William picked up the phone and made a few strategic calls. The next morning would deliver a lesson in humility, and not just for Chadwick Thompson, but for the whole team at Boston Luxury Motors. The sun rose on a picture-perfect morning. Chadwick walked into the dealership with his usual swagger, adjusting his blue tie and feeling confident. "The woman from yesterday? Just another delusional customer with big dreams and no cash." He'd even joked about it over drinks last night. Some people really didn't understand their place. The showroom sparkled, every car positioned just right under soft lights to make the paint pop and the chrome shine. Chadwick had just wrapped up the morning meeting, reminding the sales team to qualify potential buyers carefully. "We serve a certain clientele," he told them, It's not being snobby, it's just good business." Daniel, the younger salesman, kept quiet, clearly uneasy. Chadwick made a mental note to talk to him later about the importance of sizing up customers quickly. At exactly 10:17 a.m., the low, smooth rumble of an engine turned every head in the showroom. Outside the glass wall, a car, unlike anything they'd seen, pulled up right in front of the entrance. Conversations stopped. Even Chadwick's breath caught for a second. A Rolls-Royce Phantom. But not just any Phantom. This one had a stretched wheelbase and a custom midnight blue finish that shimmered in the sunlight like a mood ring. Easily worth over $1, $2 million. "Is that—" Arthur Mason, the dealership's owner, stepped out of his office, drawn by the silence. "Bespoke Phantom," Chadwick replied, already heading for the door. "Very rare build." A uniformed chauffeur stepped out of the car, walked to the passenger side, and opened the door with crisp, practiced precision. From the back stepped a tall man, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit that spoke money without shouting it. His silver-streaked hair was slicked back, his posture confident and calm. Chadwick's instincts kicked in. This was no ordinary customer. This was the type of client dealerships fought over. Someone who might buy more than just one car. Someone who could bring long-term business worth millions. "Good morning, sir," Chadwick called, speeding up to greet the man before anyone else could. "Welcome to Boston Luxury Motors." Chadwick Thompson, sales manager. "Welcome. It's an absolute pleasure to have you with us today," Chadwick said, extending his hand with practiced ease. The man standing in front of him offered a polite smile, though his eyes remained unreadable. "William Collins," he replied, returning the handshake with calm authority. Chadwick's brain started spinning. The name sounded familiar, but he couldn't quite place it. Still, the custom Rolls-Royce outside said more than enough. Whoever this man was, he was clearly a big deal. "Mr. Collins, we're honored. What brings you in today?" "I'd love to show you some of our latest arrivals. We've just received a limited edition." William raised a hand slightly, cutting him off. "Actually, I'm here about a specific car, the Midnight Blue Azure Coupe." Chadwick's grin widened. "Ah, excellent choice. Only 15 made this year. I'd be thrilled to show it to you. It's just over—" "I know where it is," William said evenly. "My wife was here yesterday. She expressed interest in it." The smile stayed frozen on Chadwick's face, though a flicker of confusion crept into his eyes. "Your wife? I don't recall. Perhaps one of the other salespeople helped her?" Alexander's expression turned cool. "No, Mr. Thompson. You spoke with her. Or rather, you refused to. Her name is Eleanor Collins. She wore jeans and a white t-shirt. You told her she might be better off checking out the used cars." Chadwick's face went pale as the memory finally clicked. Behind him, Daniel let out a small gasp. "Mr. Collins, Chadwick stuttered, his smooth persona unraveling. "There must be some misunderstanding. We welcome everyone here." By this point, Arthur Mason, the dealership's owner, had come over, sensing something wasn't right. "Is everything okay, Chadwick?" William turned to him. "Mr. Mason, I assume?" "Yes," Arthur replied. "Arthur Mason. Welcome to Boston Luxury Motors." "Thank you," William said. "I was just informing Mr. Thompson that my wife came in yesterday hoping to buy the Azure Coupe as a gift for her sister. Instead, she was treated in a way I find troubling." Arthur's friendly demeanor faltered. I'm very sorry to hear that. I was briefly part of a conversation yesterday, but I didn't know the full story." Alexander's voice remained calm but firm. "Well, the full story is this. Your sales manager decided that based on how my wife was dressed, she didn't belong here. He made it clear she wasn't worth his time. A hush fell over the showroom. Employees, customers, and even support staff had quietly gathered to watch the exchange. "Mr. Collins," Chadwick began again, panic creeping into his tone. "If there was a misunderstanding—" "It wasn't a misunderstanding," Daniel cut in, surprising even himself. Every eye turned to him. Ms. Mitchell was respectful and clear about what she wanted. She was dismissed over and over again just because of how she looked. Chadwick shot him a death glare, but it was too late. The truth was out. William looked back at Arthur. "You know, my wife started and runs the Mitchell Foundation for Children with Disabilities. She's raised over $50 million for medical and educational support. She's dedicated her life to helping others even before we met. And she dresses simply because she believes in staying grounded. It helps her connect with the people she serves. That's one of the many reasons I love her." Arthur Mason's face had gone ghost white. "Collins, I assure you this isn't how we do business. We pride ourselves on—" "On what?" William interrupted. "Because right now your mission statement doesn't mean much. Actions speak louder." Then he paused. "Now, about the Azure. I'm not just here to buy that car. I was planning to purchase it for my sister-in-law, as Ellie intended. But I was also looking to replace a set of corporate vehicles, 7 in total, and frankly, my personal collection could use an update." Arthur's eyes widened. That kind of purchase would blow past their quarterly goals in a single deal. "But," William continued, "I'm now wondering if this is the right place to make such a meaningful investment." The room was so quiet, you could have heard a pin drop. Chadwick looked like he might pass out. "Mr. Collins," Arthur said, clearly scrambling, "please accept my sincerest apologies. This was a terrible mistake. Let us fix it. Please." William paused, taking in the room, the silence, the faces, and then finally responded. "Maybe there's a way forward," William said at last, his tone calm but firm. "But it's going to take more than just handing me car keys." "Anything," Arthur Mason said quickly. "The Mitchell Foundation is hosting a fundraising gala next month," William explained. "We're raising money to build an adaptive sports complex for kids with physical disabilities." Then he turned to Chadwick, who looked like he wanted the floor to open up beneath him. "I think it would be good for you to attend." Chadwick cleared his throat. "Sir? Not as a guest," William clarified. "As a volunteer. We always need help with setup, supporting the kids, just being present to understand the work we do." The message was crystal clear. This wasn't about cars anymore. It was about empathy and earning a little perspective. William turned back to Arthur. "Also, it might be worth considering a staff training program around unconscious bias. I can connect you with some outstanding consultants." Arthur nodded quickly, grateful for anything that might help fix the mess. "Absolutely. That would be a welcome step." Then William looked at Daniel. "I'd like you to handle the paperwork, starting with the Azure for my sister-in-law." Daniel blinked in surprise. "Me? Thank you, sir. That means a lot." "Good," William said, nodding. "Now, let's go over the details of that corporate fleet." As they walked toward the office, he paused beside the Azure, running his hand over the smooth curve of the hood. "My wife has impeccable taste, doesn't she?" Behind them, Chadwick remained frozen, the reality of what had just happened hitting him hard. His perfect little world had been flipped, and not by some corporate scandal or business deal, but by the way he treated someone he thought didn't matter. A month later, the Mitchell Foundation Gala turned the Grand Boston Hotel into a joyful, moving celebration. Families with children of all abilities gathered alongside donors, doctors, and volunteers. Near the entrance, Chadwick stood in a staff uniform, far from his usual tailored suits, greeting guests and helping a young boy in a wheelchair navigate the crowd. What had started as a condition of keeping his job had become something else entirely. He hadn't expected it to change him, but it had. Across the room, Ellie approached, graceful in a simple blue dress. Even knowing who she was now, Chadwick was struck again by how humble and approachable she seemed. "How's the experience been, Chadwick?" she asked gently. He thought for a moment. "Humbling," he said, "and necessary." She gave a small nod. "Thomas seems to like you," she said, glancing at the boy he'd been helping. "He's been teaching me adaptive basketball," Chadwick admitted with a slight smile. "Apparently, I've got terrible form." That made Ellie laugh. "He's a brutally honest coach." Chadwick's smile faded into something more sincere. "Mrs. Collins, I know I've given you a formal apology, but I need to say it to your face. I'm truly sorry for how I treated you. There's no excuse." "You're right," she said plainly, but without anger. "So what have you learned?" "That real worth isn't based on clothes, money, or job titles," Chadwick replied. "It's about how you treat people. Everyone deserves respect until they give you a reason otherwise, not the other way around." "Those are solid lessons," she said thoughtfully. "Costly ones, I imagine." Chadwick let out a sheepish laugh, thinking of the fleet sale they'd lost. "Worth every penny." Just then, William joined them, resting a hand on Ellie's shoulder. "Chadwick was just telling me what he's learned," she said. William nodded. "I hear you've gotten pretty involved with the adaptive sports program." "Yes, sir. Actually, I've decided to keep volunteering beyond the initial requirement," Chadwick said. "And I've been working with Mr. Mason to change how we approach customers. No more judging by appearances." "I'm glad to hear that," William said. Then he added with a small smile, "Which reminds me, that corporate fleet I mentioned? We're still in the market. Maybe you'd like to handle the sale. Daniel's mentioned how much he's learned working with you." Chadwick looked stunned for a second, then nodded, genuinely moved. "I'd be honored, Mr. Collins. Truly." Later that night, as the event wound down, Chadwick watched Ellie and William mingling with guests. Not showing off, not looking for attention, just sincerely connecting with families and children. And for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He thought back on how much his perspective had changed. Just a month earlier, he probably would have brushed off someone like Ellie Mitchell without a second thought, just because of how she looked. Now he knew better. Real worth has nothing to do with expensive clothes, flashy cars, or job titles. It runs deeper into character, heart, and how you treat people. As Chadwick helped Thomas back into his wheelchair after a photo session, the boy looked up at him with a grin. "You know what, Miss Chadwick? You're pretty cool for a grown-up." Chadwick chuckled. "Coming from you, Thomas, that's the best compliment I've gotten in a long time." And he meant every word. We all jump to conclusions sometimes, don't we? But Chadwick Thompson learned that when you take the time to look beyond appearances, you might discover incredible people and experiences you never expected. If this story touched you, hit that subscribe button and stick around. Our little community of story lovers would be lucky to have you. Drop a comment below if you've ever misjudged someone, or if you've been misjudged yourself. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear. And remember, real wealth isn't about how much you own. It's about how you treat others, especially when you think nobody's watching. See you in the next story, where another unforgettable lesson is waiting.